Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nick Radicani, and I'd like to welcome you to the Amplify Virtual STEM Forum. I'm the Director of Marketing here for Amplify Science, and I have a couple of exciting guests to join us in a moment. But before we start, just a couple housekeeping items. So as you may have expected, you are here for an exciting session called Leading with Phenomena, Mystery in Desert Rocks Canyon. Like I said, I'll be introducing our presenters in a moment, but just a couple things to get out of the way and answer some questions you might have. So first off, as part of this forum, we want to make sure that you're continuing to get high quality professional development that you would have gotten pre-COVID, but we also want to make sure we're addressing the new reality of remote learning that you're all living in right now. So just to start, I'm going to launch a poll, and if you all want to take a couple moments just to answer a couple brief poll questions we have in there, I'll leave it up while I'm talking. But for today, we're going to spend some time exploring the role of phenomena and the role of phenomena in the next generation science standards. And I'll be joined, or we'll all be joined, by Rebecca Abbott and Leslie Stanger of UC Berkeley's Lawrence Hall of Science. And shortly after that, we'll also be joined by Alestra Menéndez, who's on Amplify's professional learning team. And the three presenters will be exploring how schools around the country have been using the phenomena-based approach to provide rich learning experiences in a remote learning setting. Alestra is going to be talking about some case studies and things that she's seen working with districts around the country. And Rebecca and Leslie are going to be talking more about the content side of phenomena-based learning. So lastly, I promise I'm going to turn it over to our presenters in a moment. Just a couple things, more logistical things. On your screen, you'll notice that there is a Q&A tab as well as a chat tab. If you'd like to chat with other folks on the call, you're all on listen only mode, so you won't be able to talk. However, you can chat with other folks on the call in the chat bar. If you have any questions, you can put those in the Q&A tab, and we'll make sure to answer those throughout the call. We will leave some time at the end to go back and answer some of those live as part of the webinar, but we will answer those typed out, I guess, in the Q&A bar as well. After the presentation's over, you're going to be getting an email with a couple different things within the next 24 hours. The email will come from Zoom, not Amplify, so just make sure you check your spam just in case Zoom emails go to spam for whatever reason. In that email, you're going to have a link to the recording of the presentation. So if you want to watch this later, if you want to send it over to a colleague, you'll have that there. You'll also get a copy of the presentation slides in case you want to go back and look at those. And then lastly, you're going to have a link to a personalized certificate of attendance for the webinar. So all you have to do on that link is click that, type in your name, and then we're going to send you a personalized certificate of attendance that you can show to your district. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Rebecca Abbott, who is the professional learning lead at the UC Berkeley's Lawrence Hall of Science. Welcome, Rebecca, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Great. Well, thank you, Nick, for that introduction. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar called Leading with Phenomena, Mystery in Desert Rocks Canyon. And as Nick introduced me, I'm Rebecca Abbott, here with Leslie and Alestra, and we all work with teachers across the country who are implementing the new standards and for folks who are using the Amplify Science curriculum. Leslie and I, in particular, are from the Lawrence Hall of Science. This is a public science center that many of you have maybe heard of. We're based at the University of California on the Berkeley campus. And just a little background about who we are. The Lawrence Hall of Science has been creating curriculum for nearly 50 years. And our group within the hall, the Learning Design Group, engages in research and curriculum development. Our primary focus over the last several years has been to create a K-8 science program designed from the ground up to meet the NGSS. We've had a deep collaboration over the years with our publishing partner Amplify to accomplish this. So we've basically taken what the Lawrence knows best about how students learn science deeply and what Amplify knows from more than a decade of using technology to innovate teaching and learning to create Amplify Science. It's a comprehensive core curriculum for science instruction. And we've been able to bring it to thousands of teachers across the country who are looking for a research-based NGSS designed curriculum. So here is the plan for this session. The title, of course, is Leading with Phenomena. We're going to spend about 35 minutes or so to explore generalizable principles about teaching and learning with a phenomenon-based approach, what this looks like in our curriculum, and how that reflects the vision of the NGSS. Our goal is to deepen your understanding of a phenomena-based approach, whether you currently use Amplify Science or not. And especially in this time where we're all working to provide rich learning experiences in a remote setting, we believe that understanding the why and how behind this approach can help inform you as you're making these instructional decisions. In this first section, we'll look at the paradigm shift overall, look at an example from Amplify Science, and reflect on the approach. In this first part of the session, we won't be addressing strategies for remote teaching directly, but we will in the next section, which is going to be the case studies. Well, I'll pass it to Alestra at that point so she can give you some ideas about how we're seeing teachers and instructional leaders enact phenomena-based learning in remote teaching settings. So for now, I want to pass it to Leslie for a moment, who's going to read off who else we have on the webinar with us.
All right, hello everyone. From the poll, we can see that we really have a mix of participants, some who are using Amplify Science, others who are not. We have a range of educators from K through 8 and even some high school and a little bit of universities and a lot of a variety of school and district positions. So welcome to everyone. And so I also wanted to reiterate some of the logistics that Nick mentioned earlier. We have the two buttons at the bottom of your screen, the chat and the Q&A. And so we use them for different purposes. Rebecca will have you interact and respond during this session using the chat feature. But if you have questions, we ask that you please use the Q&A to ask us questions. We'll be monitoring that throughout the session, and we'll be answering some questions along the way, but we'll save some of the questions to go over at the end of the session. So one suggestion though is if you do have a question, you can check out the answered tab and see if we've already answered your question. So looking forward to your questions. And also, as Nick mentioned, after the session, you will get an email with a recording of this webinar and a copy of the slides. And so I'm going to hand it back over to Rebecca to get started.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, yeah, welcome to everyone. It's exciting you're here. I always like to start off by recognizing the big paradigm shift that there has been since the NGSS came out. Sometimes we make the mistake of fooling ourselves and thinking, well, it's not that different than what we've been doing for the last 10 or 20 years. But it really is productive to recognize how the new paradigm is different from the old paradigm. It looks different and it feels different in the classroom. So to talk about this shift, we'll just quickly go through a historical perspective here, big picture timeline of science reform in the US. So for example, in the first half of the last century, there's a focus just on this idea of concepts, or maybe even just on facts. And the first real science education reform in the 60s, the change was characterized by a focus on what they would call process skills, like making observations, measurement, and controlling variables. Then in the 90s, the next big reform, which many of us are familiar with, was a shift to the idea of scientific inquiry. This, of course, is realization you can't just think of scientific process skills as separate and independent, but rather they're part of a more holistic activity called inquiry. And that brings us to today, or really rather the last 7 years since NGSS has been out, with the latest shift that we'll talk a lot more about. So we'll specifically focus today on the connections and the difference between the last paradigm inquiry to the paradigm of phenomena. So in just a moment, I'll have you write some of your responses in the chat box about the last paradigm in the science reform movement, inquiry-based science. Many of you either went to school using inquiry-based science, and many of you learned to teach this way. So what comes to mind when you think of inquiry-based science? Just put a couple words or phrases that come to mind in the chat box. And remember, putting this in the chat box, not the Q&A, so we can make sure that we see what you said in the chat box. So Leslie's going to read out a few of those in just a moment.
All right, so I see kids doing experiments, discover, explore, hands-on, student-driven, design your own lab, questions.
Yeah, all great responses. Yeah, this is typical of what we hear, always hands-on discovery, exploration, etc. The phrase inquiry-based science brings many things to mind. So thank you for those responses. And they continue to come in, I see. So as we keep going, so it was more than 20 years ago in 1997, the NRC came out with a set of national science education standards. And these standards were all about inquiry, inquiring in firsthand ways. We did a word count of the number of times that the word inquiry shows up in the NSES. It was 314 times as compared to a mere 49 times for phenomena. And several years later, in 2000, the NRC came out with a companion volume called Inquiry and the National Science Education Standards. So if 314 mentions of inquiry was not adequate, this book bumped up the word inquiry to over 1,000. These two documents revealed a strong message. What emerged was that the goal was to engage students in doing inquiry. The phenomena themselves were less of a focus. Students were doing to do. So how this manifested in many classrooms across the country, if you squint your eyes, was that there was often a chapter or worksheets about inquiry. Inquiry became another thing for students to learn about, adding to a list of topics and information they were expected to memorize. Now, this of course was worst case scenario, but in other places there was probably a mashup of inquiry and content delivery. You have kids doing experiments, like many of you said, learning what they could from them. But since there's a lot of science kids couldn't learn from doing this, this was accomplished, the conceptual understanding was accomplished by some other kind of content delivery, like textbook reading, videos, or lectures. So again, this is a mashup. So overall, what we would see was an inquiry-based instruction, conceptual understanding largely ended up becoming a parallel effort to inquiry, rather than integrated with it. Activities that students would do tended to be parts of units or chapters based on a topic, such as weather and water, or electricity and magnetism. And think about what was happening in the inquiry part. It always involves, like you mentioned, engaging in a first-hand investigation or experiment. And this investigation was generally limited to inquiring using things that could be inquired about in a classroom setting. So then there was typically this component of a chapter or a unit that was taught with some form of telling about concepts, a video, teacher talk, reading. Now, separating learning concepts from doing science meant that for many or most students, deep learning may not have been happening. Some students can be successful learning concepts in a transmission way, but many are not. And as teachers, we were often trying to pick between doing and building understanding. So let's flash forward to the current era, where in 2010, the first draft National Research Council framework for K-12 education science came out, revised and published in 2012. You can see the word count yielded the opposite. The word inquiry is still there. It appears 47 times, but the balance has flipped. The word phenomenon appears 113 times. So while the scale of this graph is different from the ones I showed you a few moments ago, it does show the relative emphasis on phenomena has now shifted. When the focus was on inquiry, it was on what students were doing. The focus now is on phenomena, on the things students are working to figure out. Students are still doing, but they are doing with the purpose of understanding. So what do we mean when we say scientific phenomena? Scientific phenomena are observable events that occur in the universe and that we can use our science knowledge to explain or predict. Phenomena are the things that get noticed and cause scientists and the rest of us to become curious. What is phenomena-based teaching and learning? Well, if you look at the slide here, we can think about it in this single place where students are investigating a phenomena by asking questions, researching information, and coming up with an explanation of how that phenomena works or why that phenomena works. The investigation is anchored by a real-world phenomenon. All a student's research and investigation is focused on figuring it out. The evidence sources they go to are broader than just physical hands-on. And what's great about this approach is that we don't have to pick doing or understanding because they are together. So let's take a closer look of how this plays out in curricula. Moving from an organizational structure of topics to one of phenomena has a big impact on how our curricula play out. I'll have you again chat just a few words that capture what you see here as the difference in the examples on your screen. How might this look when you teach a curriculum that's based on topics and one based on phenomena? What do you notice? How would instruction look different in a phenomena-based setting? So go ahead again in the chat, not the Q&A, type in a few thoughts, and I'll have Leslie read those out.
All right, I can see, let's see, real world relevance, figuring out, depth, students know how it applies to them.
Very
It makes
nice.
you think.
Makes you think. Great. Yeah, and so often those are the responses that we hear when we talk about depth or broader or real world connections based on students' interests and so forth. And a lot of people have said, and maybe folks are continuing to chat this, but maybe the phenomena often do include the topic, but they're broader. And so if we just moving on quickly here to the next slide, a big difference that we've seen and a shift that I think a lot of you are chatting about right now is that a key difference is that it shifts the focus from learning about to figuring out. Topic-based approaches focused on learning about really keep students in the role of a student, whereas phenomenon-based approaches focused on figuring out put students in the role of a scientist or engineer. It moves students to the center of the investigation. They are the ones figuring out phenomena using the practices of scientists. All right, so we're going to go on now to talk about how we can guide students in this endeavor to ensure they're successful in figuring out phenomena like a scientist. So to illustrate a structure for this, I am going to engage you in a quick piece of a grade 4 Amplify Science unit. I saw we had many middle school teachers, but the approach still applies. You may want to have a paper and pencil handy for some observations, and if you have someone next to you to be your talk partner, that's even better. But keep in mind the goal here is to show you the structure of a phenomena-based sequence. So this is a super abbreviated example. I won't be going into the unit itself. The anchor phenomena, as we promised in the title here, is the grade 4 Earth's features. It's situated in a place called Desert Rocks Canyon. Students learn about canyons and how they're steep valleys made of rocks, and these outcrops are super interesting because they give us a look at what's under the ground, something that's normally covered with plants. A fossil was observed here, and finding this fossil in the outcrop is the main phenomena that guides the unit. An anchor phenomena like this one invites students to ask why or how something works. Anchor phenomena need to be rich and complex enough and with enough ideas embedded in them that they can motivate learning for an entire instructional unit. And an anchor phenomena is specific to one event or location and not just general. In this case, it's the mysterious fossil. And because this is a big phenomena and a complex one, what we do in our units is we break down how students figure it out into learning sequences called chapters. So we'll spend some time looking at a sequence from chapter 1. How did the fossil get inside the rocky outcrop? This is even a big question, so we break it down farther. How do fossils form? This is the first thing we're going to tackle. Now, we together will not spend a ton of time with this one, but what we will do is just take a quick look at what students do over a few lessons. They look at fossils scientists have found, they read a book about how geologists gather information, and they investigate using a simulation. And they start gaining active control over vocabulary during this process, like fossil, sediment, organisms. And what students figure out from those few lessons is that for organisms to turn into fossils, they need to be covered with sediment, which is part of the puzzle, but we still don't know how the sediment turned into rock. How did the fossil get into the rocky outcrop? So we go to a second question, which is how does sedimentary rock form? We will spend a little more time on this one. So a natural first step, of course, is to gather firsthand evidence. Students get started by observing real rocks. Students observe the rocks, discuss what they see, and they also write and draw to capture this valuable data. And this is a great set of observations to do at home. If you can see me, I actually picked up some rocks near my house. I went on a rock hunt and I was looking for ones that had sediment in them. And I didn't have a magnifying glass at home, but I was able to use my phone and zoom in to see the details. For you all, I also found a picture online. There's lots of these if you want to do a search. And I zoomed in on it. So I want you to take a moment now to make some observations. You can use words in the chat, or make a quick sketch next to you if you're a sketcher. If you're watching with someone else, just go ahead and talk to them next to you. What do you say? You know, what would you say that you observe about this rock, the zoom in view? I'm not going to have you necessarily chat. We're not going to read your responses out loud, but I will give you just a few moments to think about what you observed. I see the chats rolling in. And so a lot of folks are talking about the texture of the rock and the different colors and the different size of sediment. So those are fantastic observations. When geologists observe sedimentary rock, one detail they observe is the size of the sediment that makes up the rock, the texture, and the colors. This particular rock is made up of large sediment mixed with smaller sediment, although the sizes are very close. So students at this point would share what they noticed, but also talk about what they're wondering about. Where's the sediment come from? How did it get to the rock? So to answer our questions, I would love it if we could see rocks forming in live time, but we know that takes so long and we wouldn't be able to watch that happen in a classroom. So it's a good time to turn to our simulation. Each of our units in Amplify Science contain a unique simulation starting in grade 4. Students would have used the simulations before this moment in time and would continue to use it throughout the unit as they're investigating specific questions. And in elementary school, normally we would have students work with partners with the sim. So they talk about what they observe and interact with it. So the first time students would use the sim, they just explore. They figure out all the features, they observe what's happening. And so I'm going to go ahead and toggle over to the sim now and show you what they might find. So now on your screen, you can see it actually moving in live time. So you can see some basic features. Basically, as students first explore this, they notice, okay, there's a landscape along the bottom. There are 3 zoom-ins on different parts of the environment. And you might even notice that the river is flowing in the upper river and in the floodplain and in the beach. Some things that you can do in this simulation is you can change the sea level, and I'm just going to move around the screen. You can change the speed, you can add organisms, and the most important thing here is you can fast forward and move time ahead by 10,000 years at a time. So I'm going to advance this now, and I want you to watch, because remember, our students would explore initially, but at this point, we're really thinking about how does sedimentary rock form? That's been our question. So I'm going to fast forward it and see if you can find any clues about how that might be happening. Okay, so one other button that I have here is called Analyze Layers. I'm going to go ahead and click on that and see if that gives you any clues. I'm going to unclick that and fast forward again and see if you notice anything about how sedimentary rock might be forming. All right, I see folks are making some really good observations here, and I'll analyze the layers one more time. So yeah, many of you are observing the rock layers actually forming. You may have noticed that the additional layers of rock are forming mostly in the floodplain and the beach, but some people, we have noticed that the upper river doesn't have any additional layers forming. People also start to notice that the sediment turns into rock in the places when it's underwater, and that the sediment didn't form layers of rock right away, or it happened over time. So a class would, of course, have way more time to observe, talk, explore, but at this point, it's likely that students can explain that sedimentary rock forms when sediment builds up in water and is covered with more sediment. All right, so the next thing that we would go to help us would be to go to another source of evidence. It can help students understand this process and articulate an understanding. So I'm going to go ahead and move to another source that we have in the Amplify Science program, which is a book. Students had already read this book. This is called Clues from the Past. They had already read it once to learn about how geologists gather evidence and how they figure out what happened a long time ago from what they find. So this time they're returning to the text for a specific purpose. Again, they're trying to figure out how does sedimentary rock forms. So I'm going to go ahead and turn to a specific page because they are asked to do this. When I go to page 7, we'll take a look at a diagram. We'll take a look to see what new ideas we can get about how sedimentary rock forms. So if you take a look just at this right-hand page on page 7 with the diagrams, hopefully it's big enough on your screen where you can actually read it. Just go ahead and take about 30 seconds to read and be thinking about what new concepts that the diagrams and the pictures can help you understand. I'll just give you a second to read that. Okay, so that was really just a few seconds to read that. Often we hear after folks read this that the book introduces new terms like compact and cement that maybe you'd been using when you were talking about the simulation, but here you can see them as verbs in text, and it gives you a way to talk about sediment settling and ways to describe how sediment gets stuck together and forms into rocks. It also provides another view of the process. It's very complementary to the sim, but it highlights that the process happens underwater. And finally, it provides vocabulary and ideas that can help support students as they move from visualizing what happens in the rock formation to articulating and writing about the process. All right, so I'll go back to my slides. So we gathered evidence from our rock form observations, from the simulations, and then the book to figure out how sedimentary rock forms. And at this point, students would be able to explain that a sedimentary rock layer forms when sediment sinks and builds up in water, compacts under more sediment, and then cements over time. So that's the end of our little sequence, and I want to take a look now at a diagram to sort of help explain what we just experienced. So we started off with the chapter phenomena, and we started off by investigating fossils. We did that quickly, we didn't really do it together. But this led us to a question about how does sedimentary rock form? This was our second investigative phenomena in the chapter. We gathered evidence from the hands-on investigation of rocks using a digital model and an informational text. And it led us to this key idea or key concept. Now, the last phase of this process, of the figuring out process, is now using the ideas about how fossils form and how sedimentary rocks form to be able to explain the phenomena. That the fossil is the preserved remains of an organism living in this area long ago, which is then covered by layers of sediment. So using this diagram is something I want to point out. This is what a process can look like anytime you have an anchor phenomena. To guide students in figuring out an anchor phenomena, we use a coherent flow of instruction. Questions about the investigative phenomena lead students to gathering evidence from multiple sources, which they then use to figure out new science ideas, ultimately applying those ideas to make sense and explain the anchor phenomena. If you were with us on Monday and saw our session then, you may already be familiar with this structure and this approach. Today, we're talking about leading with phenomena, and Monday's session focused on evidence, but clearly these aspects of the approach are closely related. So let's step back now to reflect on this phenomena-based approach. And I'll have you chat again. Based on that quick example, what did you see in terms of how we figured out that phenomena like a scientist? Or if you can imagine that in a classroom, what would students be doing to figure that out? I'll give you a few moments to chat and any words or phrases that come in mind. How we figured out like a scientist. And I'll have Leslie read a couple of these out.
All right, we made observations, we asked questions, made models, observed. Let's see. We did some reading, checked some evidence.
Okay, those are great. Yeah, so we did a lot of things that were just like scientists. Students were collecting evidence from books, from simulations, from observations, and importantly, they synthesized information from a few different sources. But the whole while, they're doing it for a purpose. They're trying to figure out problems and questions. We also did this super briefly, but scientists engage in sense-making and communication as they're talking and writing. So affording students these same opportunities only makes sense. In the last 20 years, this is what used to be the mantra: inquire like a scientist. But as many of you just mentioned in the chat, what we experienced was much broader than this. In the phenomena-based era, in addition to be able to inquire like a scientist, we also want students to be able to think like a scientist, quantify like a scientist, read, talk, write, critique, and argue like a scientist. This is what figuring out in science looks like. When students are challenged to figure out like a scientist, the expectations are broader. The NRC framework embraces the reality that scientists engage in a wide range of practices, so it follows that we now have standards that underscore the importance of this broader view of science practices. So many of you are familiar with the NGSS, and these ways of figuring out are encompassed in the science and engineering practices, one of the 3 dimensions of NGSS. Because these practices reflect what professional scientists do. Scientists use practices to figure out disciplinary core ideas. We engaged in a few of these, the ones highlighted and potentially others in our condensed instructional sequence. We were working to figure out core ideas related to patterns of rock formations, how they reveal changes over time, how living things affect the physical characteristics of different regions. We used practices to do that. And as we figured out these core ideas, cross-cutting concepts came up. Here are the 7 cross-cutting concepts. Reflecting on these helps students connect what they figure out to the bigger ideas in science. Often here, people say stability and change emerge naturally as a cross-cutting concept, but also patterns and cause and effect. If you have NGSS designed curriculum materials, these cross-cutting concepts should be baked in. So I consider the single phrase, figuring out phenomena like a scientist or engineer, as the most important phrase for communicating what an NGSS approach to teaching and learning looks like. Now, the reason we've titled this talk, Lead with Phenomena, is because we've been starting with that phrase. We've found it's a better way to capture the NGSS approach than with the phrase 3-dimensional teaching and learning. Phenomena-based instruction is more clear, it's less jargon, and it's more accessible. That said, you can't do phenomena-based instruction without the 3 dimensions. As we just debriefed from our sequence, we talked about how we were using all 3 dimensions to figure out. So they're both important. It does make us wish that the NGSS had been rolled out with figure out phenomena like a scientist as the mantra, rather than the 3-dimensional approach. But we fully acknowledge that 3-dimensional, it does a lot for us. It gives us a helpful way to operationalize the connections of practices and content. When we talk about operationalizing, we mean that the standards themselves are written using all 3 dimensions. So to meet the standards, you need to engage in all 3 of these dimensions in any given performance task. The 3 dimensions were super helpful to us, for example, as curriculum designers, to use as a tool. And it's helpful for educators who need to be explicit in what areas students are developing proficiency over time. So working together, the 3-dimensional learning engages students in using the scientific and engineering practices and applying those cross-cutting concepts as tools to develop an understanding of and figuring out phenomena related to disciplinary core ideas. In other words, students figure out phenomena like a scientist or engineer using all 3 dimensions. So to sum up, leading with phenomena is an approach to help guide students to figure out like a scientist. If you're using a curriculum designed for NGSS, it will have this approach core to its structure. So what we encourage you to do is keep the same approach in mind whenever you're planning for making adjustments to a curriculum. And in this particular moment, to keep it in mind while you're planning for remote teaching. We realize there's a huge range of implementation scenarios happening in your schools and in your context, and Alestra will speak to some of those in a few moments. The range that we've seen, of course, is from teachers who are able to continue learning with Amplify Science in some form to those who are using either bits and pieces of the curriculum as they can or bits and pieces of various resources. And of course, we have a huge disparity in different areas where students have access to different levels of digital tools and support in their home settings. So you know your context best and what could possibly work. And given your context, you just might want to consider, is there an anchor phenomena I can still lead with? Something that can sustain learning over time? Or perhaps you could consider if there's a smaller investigative phenomena your students can gather evidence around. Perhaps they gather evidence from the same sources we just took a look at, from books, from observations, from research, or from digital tools like simulations. So I just encourage you to keep these principles in mind to help you make pedagogical decisions. All right, well, I will stop there and pass it over to Alestra, who's going to give you some examples of case studies from the field of what we've been seeing.
Wonderful, Rebecca. Can everyone see and hear me now? I'm having a little bit of a slow start to my internet, but thank you for waiting. My name is Alestra Menéndez, and my job is to support teachers through professional learning who are using Amplify Science. And today I want to share with you some of the resources that we have created and shared with our partners who are using Amplify Science and that are also available for teachers curious about learning more about Amplify Science. And so what you'll see here is our website for resources for supporting remote learning. And Leslie's going to be dropping in the chat feature the links to these resources. So I'll go ahead and check and see that you folks have access to that link, and I'll go ahead and navigate you to this resource. Okay, thank you, Leslie. So what we have here is our remote learning website. And when you scroll down, what you'll notice is our menu here on the left-hand side. There's a very helpful video that my colleague Brooke Benetone recorded to walk you through this site. And so if after today you trying to remember what was it that Alestra showed me, you can go ahead and watch that video to review. Now, before we go to these different resources, I just want to point you down below the video, which I think is going to be very helpful when you're thinking about how am I going to adapt my current instruction to remote learning. We have a guide for K-5 as well as for 6-8 that can give you some suggestions. So if I go here on this site, and I'm going to go ahead and move this out of my way, what you'll notice is for the adapting Amplify Science to remote learning, similar to what Rebecca was sharing about figuring out phenomenon through these variety of modes, you have suggestions for how would I adapt, for example, the hands-on investigations to a remote situation. And so there are some tips there for you, as well as some really great videos of teachers actually doing this. I'm gonna come down here to share also some tips for discussions or readings, like the reading that Rebecca shared with you today. Because Amplify Science teachers have access to those books in a digital format, we're hearing that many districts are choosing to have reading as one of the highlighted modalities for learning science through this digital book where students can access those and read them, and teachers are even recording themselves doing a read aloud, but projecting that digital version of the book. We also have some suggestions here for if you are wanting to check in on your students and their understanding. So I'm going to go ahead and jump over to the 6th grade version so that you can see that we also have this for grades 6 through 8 and organized in the very same way. So I'm a classroom teacher and I'm guiding my students through using the Amplify Science program remotely. How can I adapt those hands-on investigations for my students? So that would be the same format here for grade 6 through 8. And the science seminar, for example, is one wonderful discussion that students engage in to really think through phenomenon and to support their claims with evidence. How could I do this in a remote setting, knowing that the value of this kind of activity for my students to really engage in oral argumentation with their peers. Again, students also have those articles that are digital and gives the teachers suggestions for how they could support their students to be doing the reading remotely, and also maybe commenting on some of the annotations that the students can then get the teacher feedback. Okay, so they wanted to point those out again here on the remote learning site and just below this video. So I'm going to move over now to the left-hand menu here. As you can see, there are going to be some print resources available to you, as well as digital resources and some video lessons for students. Another thing to remember is, you know, parents right now are also partners in this whole remote learning environment that we're in. And so we have provided some parent letters that can be adapted to your own families, but, you know, kind of give you sort of a template to work from on how you can explain to parents sort of what this remote learning in science will be looking like. And for your upper grade students, you know, for the older students in middle school, some resources for how could I be talking with my students about COVID-19. So I'll go ahead and share with you the print resources first. If I click on print resources, it's going to bring me here to the print resources, and you'll notice there's a link that you'll want to select. So when I go to this link, it's going to take me to either the K-5 or the 6-8 remote learning resources. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down, and I want to point out that all of these resources are available both in English and Spanish. So if you are, for example, supporting English learners, or you're a teacher who works in a dual language immersion environment, then you have those resources as well. So Rebecca was sharing with us a wonderful, you know, phenomenon-based instruction from grade 4. I'll go ahead and go there. And you can see here that this vision and light unit is available to download some home lessons that can be remotely instructed to students in grade 4. And then the student books are down below. Now we have also versions in English and Spanish of all of those student books at that grade level. And teachers use classroom slides often to guide their instruction, and so the slides are also available. These are PowerPoint presentations that are fully editable, that walk students through the different evidence sources or different activities in one lesson. So we have classroom slides for the particular lessons listed here. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and jump back now to the digital resources. So those were our print resources that you can download. Here are the digital resources, and again, we shared, you know, for the 4th grade book that you saw, that would be one of the resources. For the simulation that Rebecca was sharing, those types of activities would also be available here. And for during this time of COVID-19, where we're remotely instructing our students, there is a Amplify link here that you can access those student books and the simulations. And remote learning at tryamplify.net would be the username you would log in with. And then the password is remote learning 2020. So by going to this link, you would have access to these digital resources. And we're making these available for our partners, but for teachers who are working in this remote setting throughout the end of this school year. So if this is something you would like to look into and, you know, to try sharing with your students, we welcome you to do that. And here are the ways that you can access those digital resources. Now I'm going to go ahead and go to another website. And so Leslie can go ahead and put this website in the chat for you. This is a little bit different because what you'll see in this free resources website is that there have actually been teachers who are Amplify Science users providing video lessons. And so the way I've seen these be used is sometimes a teacher will assign these to their students to watch another teacher teach a lesson, and then maybe they'll have some follow-up activities that they'll do with their students. So using sort of the video as a, go ahead and do now, watch this video, and then we'll come back as a class and we'll do an activity together. Another way I've heard teachers using these videos that have been recorded by users of Amplify Science is the teacher will watch. For example, if I go to grade 4 and I'm a grade 4 teacher, I'm going to go ahead and watch the lesson that this teacher has submitted, and I'm going to get some ideas for, oh, how could I create my own video? Or you know, how would I adapt this particular lesson to now a remote environment for my students? So those are the two ways I've been hearing from teachers that they're using these. And I have just a few resources I want to share with you in addition to the teacher-made videos. So I'm going to go ahead and come back here so that you can see an elementary example. So this was created for grade 1 students. This is what a teacher is using to share out with the students and their families and providing links. So for example, in this Spinning Earth grade 1 unit, the teacher has shared out in week 3 of remote learning, this is a lesson that we're going to be highlighting. Here's the purpose of the lesson. Here are some materials that you need. And for this particular grade 1 lesson, the teacher has added links to the student investigation notebook pages, and then has provided that home study that we shared, you know, that family facing document of what could you do at home, you know, to engage in conversations around the phenomenon that students are exploring. And then there is additional, you know, maybe it's a copy master the teacher has selected to share. That book is here. And again, some teachers do it as a video and they read it aloud to their students in grade 1. But they also can provide the link so that the families can read the book as a family. And just like Rebecca had demonstrated, you can click through those the pages of that book. So that's a first grade example. And this is a middle school example, if we have any middle school teachers here with us today. This is a hyperdoc that this teacher has created and has shared out with their students. I've seen this shared through Google Classroom. Sometimes the teacher might add this hyperdoc in an email to families. So different ways I'm seeing teachers share these out. And as you can see, this is more a unit of study as opposed to a lesson. So for these particular lessons, the teacher wants their students to look at these slides and engage in some particular activities where students are really evaluating evidence. This teacher has also created their own videos and posted those on YouTube. And the students can watch the video and then they have a directive. Okay, now after you've watched my video, I'm talking through some of these hands-on materials that you would have been using were we all together. I'm just going to demonstrate them and now we're going to have a conversation around them, for example. So I'll show you what that. So this is, for example, this particular lesson, the teacher has recorded a video for students. Teachers are saying that they try to keep these to about 15 minutes when they do sort of an instructional video for their students and post those, and then provide links to the different activities they would do following the video in something like a hyperlink doc. Okay, so feel free if you have any questions about the resources that I just shared, go ahead and put those in the Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Rebecca, Leslie, and thanks so much.
All right, thank you, Alestra and Rebecca. And so we are going to try to answer some of the questions that have been coming through in the Q&A. Thank you. We hope we've been able to answer some of them as we've gone, but I'll start with a couple and then call on Rebecca and Alestra maybe to help out. So there were some questions about, as Rebecca was going through the example, about some of the chapter questions or the sub questions, and someone else asked a question about a driving question board. And so in Amplify Science, we do provide the flow of questions for the units in order to guide students to work in a coherent way as they figure out those core concepts and the standards. And there's also a classroom wall where the class keeps track of the questions and what students have figured out. In Amplify Science, there are many opportunities for students to ask their own questions, and we've seen teachers use the classroom wall materials to create versions of driving question boards. So that opportunity is definitely there. We also had some questions about three-dimensional learning objectives. Are the lessons three-dimensional? And all the lessons, the chapters, the units, they're all three-dimensional. And so there are three-dimensional statements as part of each lesson. We also had a question about the digital tools that you saw. So you saw an example of a simulation in what Rebecca was showing. And there was a question about whether pre-K through second grade has digital tools like the one we saw. And so we don't have digital tools in pre-K through first grade, but both second and third grade do have some digital tools. And then in grades 4 through 8, there are digital tools as well as simulations in every unit. And so that is great, really, for this time, is that students can have access to those digital tools. And so another question that came up is what resources are built in to provide better access for struggling readers? I'm going to pass that one to Rebecca so she can talk about that.
And I know Alestra will have more to say as well, but I'll start. Yeah, so we get that question a lot because we do provide grade level appropriate text for students, which often means that that's a bit of a stretch for many students. But we wanted to make sure we preserved the content and the complexity at the grade level rather than providing the level type of text that many systems are used to doing. So we opt for, exactly as you said in the question, we opt for access for readers who need that access, and we opt to provide a plethora of supports. So one of the supports comes in an embedded way. So you saw that when we were reading a text in that example, we didn't just cold read a text and say, here, read this text. Or in middle school, that would be an article. We never say just cold read an article to learn some facts from it. It's always in a context. And so students are already working with vocabulary, already working with concepts. So that embedded way that the books and articles are within the curriculum is a huge support and something that we've done a lot of research around. And then the second piece of supporting students with reading is what we call differentiation supports. And those are additional supports that, that we've written into the curriculum, and every single lesson includes them, giving teachers specific strategies for that article or specific strategies for that book in order to support students in accessing the content. And those could be in line with strategies you're already using, such as paired reading, partner reading, read alouds, etc. But we provide lots of ideas for you to be able to support students in accessing those texts.
And then I just want to add, there was a question about what about differentiation for students with learning disabilities or English language learners, and the resource that Rebecca just mentioned. Every lesson has some notes about that lesson, about how you can differentiate it for students who might need extra support, for English language learners, and also for students who might need an extra challenge, so that those are available. And so just scanning to see if there are some other questions. There are some questions about how long these resources will be available, and definitely through the end of this year. And I think it's a question about how long after that. I'm not sure if Alestra or Nick want to jump in with anything about that, but definitely through the end of this year.
Yeah, so this is Nick. Yeah, we're still kind of in talks on, just with the uncertainty out there, figuring out how long we're going to be offering the free resources. So at the very least, they'll be out there through the end of the summer. So you guys, through the end of the school year, can use those, and over the summer as well. We can't really commit to anything beyond that because we don't really know what's going to happen. But for now, through the end of the school year, they'll be out there.
All right. Just scanning some of the question. I did get a request to go back 2 slides. If Alestra, you would.
This is a popular slide.
Yes, and I think that's been asked about a couple times. There was a question about some of the 7th grade remote resources and maybe the lesson videos are only the last 2 units. And there's a question, so will there be lesson videos on other units? I'm asking that of maybe Nick and Alestra.
Yeah, so that's a trickier question or trickier answer. So we're working with a couple districts around the country, and teachers are actually filming these as we speak. So they started with the lessons they were teaching with their students. So that's why we identified the ones that you're seeing now. We're trying to get as many done as possible. There's something like 48 lesson or units in the entire K-8 program, so I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them. But we are posting new lessons from units every Thursday. So if you keep checking back on the site, you'll see those on there. I'm not trying to dodge the answer, but it's hard to promise what teachers are going to record. So the best I can say is keep checking every Thursday and you'll see new lessons and units on there.
I'm going to go back 1 slide. I got a request for elementary.
All right, and while Alestra's doing that, there's a question about, do these units come with a pacing guide? And definitely guidance around how many lessons and how long each lesson takes, and when in the year they would go. So absolutely, there is guidance. And in just a moment, Alestra, if you could move forward to that final slide. Just, there have been a couple questions again about how to get to the resources that you have seen and that Alestra showed you. So these are all the URLs for those sites, and to get you to all those resources and get you the remote login so you can see the student side and access the SIMs and the digital tools. And so hopefully we've been able to answer most of your questions, and I'm going to hand it back over to Nick.
Thank you. All right, so just to close it out, and I realize we didn't get to all of your questions. It's impossible to keep up with them all, unfortunately. I appreciate you guys all asking questions. You have my email. It's nraducanu@amplify.com as part of your registration. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I'll either answer them myself or get to the person who knows a better answer than I do. So again, appreciate all your questions. Apologies to those that we couldn't get to. But again, if you email me, it's on your Zoom link. I'll be happy to answer. Just one last thing. Within the next 24 hours, like I mentioned, you'll be getting an email from Zoom, not from Amplify. So just make sure you don't have Zoom blocked or anything like that, or check your spam just in case. But within the next 24 hours, you're going to get an email from Zoom. It'll have a link to the recording of this session. You'll also have a link to download the presentation slides from this session. You'll have a link in there as well to request a certificate of attendance that is personalized to you. So again, if you want to show that to your district, you'll have that option as well. So again, just keep an eye out for that email. You'll have a link to the recording, link to the slides, and a link to request a certificate. With that, I'd like to thank all of our presenters today, and I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to join us. I know you have a lot going on, and we appreciate you taking the hour to join us for this call. And thanks again, Alestra, Leslie, and Rebecca. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.